Hey, Uncle Greg's been gone for a while, but I'm back now, so we're going to get caught up. So let's get to it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Uncle Greg Show and Podcast, where we talk all things personal safety, particularly as it relates to the personal safety of black folks. I know you've probably been wondering, where's Uncle Greg been for the last month or so? Well, I'm going to tell you. I initially had planned to take a couple of weeks off and just get some things taken care of personally, but as life would have it, and as life always gets in the way, things came up which required my attention and my involvement. You know, we last talked, we had talked about things related to these active shooter massacres that have continually gone on around the country, in particular Buffalo and, later Uvalde. Since that time, we've had two more. In the 4th of July shooting in Highland Park, Illinois, as well as the one that recently happened the other day in Indiana, in Greenwood, Indiana, in the mall. And during this time, your Uncle Greg has appeared on television where they asked me to discuss these incidents from my background in law enforcement and training as it relates to active shooter scenarios and situations. And I've been on TV probably no less than 4 or 5 times. I appear generally on the same show. Shout out to Isaiah Carey on Fox 26 in Houston. It's his show. Isaiah Factor Uncensored. And he has me on there with a number of guests at different times. They have these panel discussions about what's going on as far as these active shooter cases, and I give my opinion, I give my expertise, I give my thoughts, all in regards to what can be done to deal with these type of situations. And my belief is, first, people always ask the same question, is what can we do to stop it? But the bottom line is you're not going to stop them. And to make matters worse, they're going to increase because there are just too many guns and too much access, or too much easy access to guns in this country. Now, that being said, am I an advocate for taking away guns? No, not hardly, because if we start taking away guns, the first guns they're going to take away are ours. And I don't want that to happen to any of us who legally own guns for our own self-defense and protection. And I'm going to be talking about that a little later on. But there are things out there that are taking place that people tend to ignore, whether it's a school shooting or any other type of shooting. There are patterns, there are profiles, and we all know what they are, and we all know who the shooters tend to be just based on statistics. But nothing's going to be done, particularly from a legislative branch. They're not going to get involved because the gun lobby in this country is too strong. On the other end, when you take school shootings, for example, the safety programs they have don't work for the most part. And I know this for being involved in them, because they don't address the issues on one end, and they always plan for what to do after an attack occurs on the other. So there's a gap in the middle, and that gap is not being addressed. Thus, the reason Uncle Greg has been busy and off the air. I've been speaking with teachers about school safety, and in the process, I've started developing a program that's going to be unlike any other, that's going to address some of these issues and take a totally different approach to school safety. Because if you notice, when they talk about school safety, they talk about anything from arming teachers. I just saw was on a discussion, was on TV yesterday, talking about how Cobb County, Georgia wants to arm non-officer civilians to patrol the schools, and talked about how much of a bad idea that is, just like arming teachers, because there's too much that can happen, and you're not going to get people who are, in my opinion, we're going to be properly trained enough. They're not going to be properly equipped or armed enough. You're not going to give them AR-15s to compete with AR-15. And you're not going to get people who have the proper mindset that when you're put in a stressful life or death situation like this, you're going to be able to respond. You want me to respond by myself against someone who is better armed and who's probably had a better, definitely had more time to plan their assault. There's no one more dangerous than a person who doesn't care about dying. And most of these active shooters don't care about dying. So then they're committed to what they're doing. Are you going to get that same level of commitment from these civilians or these non-officers or teachers that you armed? I think not, because you couldn't get it. You couldn't get it for the police officers that were involved in Uvalde. You had over 300 to 400 cops on the scene in Uvalde, and it took them over an hour to act. And that's just shameful. Particularly me I was embarrassed for the law enforcement community, particularly coming from it and knowing what I know, how cops respond or generally respond in these situations, to see a bunch of cowards who refuse to act. All the while, children are being slaughtered. And if that's not enough to move you to action, I don't know what will. And so as they try to sort out this mess or that mess in this great state of Texas, kids will continue to die because they won't take the steps necessary to protect them. But that doesn't mean that I have to sit idly by and not make my contribution in what I think could help. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I will tell you more about that later on. I'm also going to be talking about the places, if you legally carry, I'm going to be talking about the places that you should always, I can't emphasize this enough, so always carry your firearm, because these are the places where you're more than likely going to be involved in some type of mass shooting incident. Not, a personal confrontation with a armed robber. I'm talking about the places more than likely a mass shooting is going to occur. I put together a list of places that I'm going to discuss in a future podcast. And it's just ironic that two of the places that I had on the list, that being the parade in Highland Park, Illinois, and the mall in Greenwood, Indiana. Not those places specifically, but mass gatherings, outdoor mass gatherings, and shopping centers and malls are two of the places I had listed that you should always carry your firearm if you are legally authorized to do so, because too many things can jump off, and those two places are the perfect example. And you saw, at least in the mall shooting, they were a civilian, legally armed civilian, was able to neutralize the shooter, and that is exactly what I'm talking about. You have to be in a position to protect those you love and yourself, and this guy was able to do so. There are some things that go along with it. You have to bear in mind what your position should be. If you're involved in those type of incidents, are you there to neutralize, or are you there to protect and defend? You can't have it both ways, because if you go one way over the other, you can find yourself in a world of legal trouble. It's just like I tell people about road rage incidents. If someone shoots at you on the highway and they drive off, and you're armed, and you chase them down and shoot, and you start shooting at them, you could end up being criminally charged, because the law only sees one thing: was a threat removed? And you have to keep that in mind in any type of situation, that ends up being an armed confrontation. Once the threat is removed, you can't continue to pursue or definitely fire at a subject, a criminal subject. In most cases, there are some exceptions, obviously, but you need to be aware of that. So we will be talking about that more in depth. We'll be talking more about firearms and ammo as well. What you should carry, what you should have, what I say, what every arsenal should have as it relates to home and personal defense, what you should have in your arsenal. Doesn't mean it's limited to the number of weapons I'm going to discuss, but you should have these weapons as a basic foundation for home and self-protection. So we're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about, I haven't been paying attention to the Jayland Walker shooter either. I've been keeping my eye on that. And we're going to talk about what we need to be doing and what the message we need to be communicating to our children about interacting with the police or law enforcement on any level, because it seems it's not getting through, or it's not getting through well enough, where we're continuing to be victimized to the point of death with these shootings, what they call excusable, justifiable shooting. But it's justifiable to who? But we have to be smarter than this, and we're not being smart. We know certain things give police officers, right or wrong, the opportunity to use deadly force. And we have to start eliminating those opportunities. And I say that, and especially when you look at this case, Jayland Walker was shot and he was running. And, he was running away. Did they have the right to shoot him? No, they didn't. But just because you don't have, you're legally right in what you're doing, doesn't mean you're not going to get killed. So we're going to talk about minimizing those opportunities for law enforcement to use deadly force so that these type of incidents well, that's something else. We're not going to stop these either, but we can definitely reduce the numbers that we're seeing, and we can definitely reduce the opportunities. So we will be discussing that as well. And finally, we're going to talk about things that you can do to stop putting yourselves at risk when it comes to your own personal safety. Not just putting yourselves at risk, but paying attention to things around you and the evil that might be right in front of you. Too many times people just, in general, ignore signs, ignore warning signs, ignore the things right in front of them that put them at risk, and they end up in trouble. And a lot of times, a lack of common sense is the biggest problem. You take too much for granted. But the moment something happens, we want to start yelling and screaming and say, why did this happen? It happened because you let it happen. Because not all cases, but in a great number of cases, you see where somebody made a fatal mistake. They didn't think about their personal safety until it was too late, even if it was then. One of my pet peeves I hear all the time, I've just listened to this and paid attention to it consistently. Now, this mainly comes from white folks in so-called good and safe neighborhoods. Uvalde is no different, because I heard it there too. Whenever something like this happens, or some major tragedy, and he said it in Highland Park as well, they always say the same thing. We never thought it would happen here, or we didn't think it would happen here. Well, the reason it did happen there is because you didn't think it would happen there. People get in this mindset that, I live in a safe neighborhood. There's no such thing as a safe neighborhood. If you're not victimized by one type of crime, you got the potential to be victimized by another. You might not have burglaries, rape, and murders going on in your neighborhood, but you got one crazy guy with an automatic weapon that's coming and killing 15 kids at a school. So don't ever think there's such a thing as a safe neighborhood. No place is safe. That's why we must always remain vigilant and diligent in protecting ourselves and paying attention to what's going on around us. because you can't take your personal safety for granted. And I'm going to be talking about things like that and what you can do. And I'm going to talk about some of the things you are doing that you, men and women, that put yourselves at risk. And you need to stop doing these things to better protect yourselves and the ones around you. And that's not just talking about people who are armed or unarmed, because it applies to both. Because the world has gotten a lot worse, and it's going to get even worse than it is now. And you have to ask yourself the question: what are you going to do? Are you going to be there or be a sheep? Or are you going to just let things happen? Or are you going to be a lion and defend yourself? I plan to be a lion, and I want lions around me. I will not go quietly into that good night. Our safety is being threatened. You hear all this talk about civil war coming in this country. Who you think are going to be the main victims in this civil war? But I got news for you: the civil war has already started. It won't be major battles like what happened back in history. They're going to be small skirmishes, and you're seeing them already. And a lot of these small skirmishes are attacks on us, whether it's in a grocery store, whether it's in a church, or whether it's right out there on the street. And you need to be aware of these things and start preparing yourself to defend yourself in case something jumps up. Heck, get on social media, get on the internet, and look at how many racial confrontations you see with white folks saying things they shouldn't be saying to us, and they start becoming physically abusive. They don't always come out on the winning end, but they're bold enough to say things to us that normally we didn't have to deal with, at least for a while. It shows you the change in generations, because coming out of the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s was a time where we set boundaries, and these racist white folk knew better than to cross them. But something happened. The baton was dropped. Everybody got touchy-feely, and you talk about this inclusiveness where you let your guard down, and now they feel comfortable to say things to us they have no business saying and do things to us they have no business doing. And then some of these folk, especially these younger generations, they're like, well, why you got to make everything about race? Because everything is about race. This country was built on race. And if you want to be naive and just try to ignore it, you're going to find yourself getting caught short, because people like you always end up, once something happens, you come running back to us expecting us to defend you when we tried to tell you in the first place that the potential for these type of things can happen. So you should always be on your guard and pay attention to what's going on, because it's right there in front of you. So now you have an idea of what's coming up and what we're going to be talking about in the very near future. I'm glad to be back, and I hope you will come back, and also tell people that you know to come over and listen to the podcast, because what I talk about, everybody needs to know what's going on out in the world. You can't be ignorant and walk around oblivious, because it's right there in your face every day. So, as I said, I hope you'll tune in and jump back on, and you'll bring some friends and family members with you. At least share. Oh, and speaking of share, I told you earlier that I had been on a few episodes discussing things related to safety and what's going on, current events, arming teachers and all that stuff. I'm going to put the links to every episode. You can watch the videos or watch the broadcast of those episodes and my discussions about those topics, along with the opinions of others, and hopefully get some useful information out of it. Speaking of useful information, I will be shortly, through my other business, TLAC Now, I will be releasing that school safety program I told you about. And this is geared and aimed primarily at teachers, because these are the folks that are impacted the most, along with the students in the classroom when these shootings take place. And no one ever asked them their opinion about the best way to stay safe in the classroom. Well, I've taken that step and done it and built an entire program around that, and why the current programs or current school safety programs fail. Because as I said, there's a gap between trying to pass legislation for gun regulation and having a reactive strategy after the shooting occurs. What's going on in the middle? And the reason the middle is not being addressed because it's something that allows individuals to control their own safety and not outside entities or bureaucrats or politicians or administrators. And that's why these programs fail. You wait on the politicians one end with legislation, then you look at the administrators on the other end with these reactive strategies. They control what goes on. And because they control what's going on and they're removed from it, people die. And it's time for that to stop. So like I said, that gap in the middle, I'm going to start filling that gap. So tell all your educator friends, I don't care what level, kindergarten all the way up through high school and even college, I guess. It's going to be applicable to all of those levels. He says it'll be simple safety strategies I discuss when I release this program. And I'll put the link down in the podcast when I give you plenty of heads up so you can pass that information on. That's if your friends who are in education are serious about their own safety, if nobody else is. Because if you saw the video of the school teacher in Uvalde who survived getting shot and watching his students get murdered, he said he followed the school safety program, safety protocol, and he said they were nothing more than sitting ducks. And that's sad. So I'm going to be changing the culture, the school safety culture and the school safety mindset for those who are willing to listen. All right. Well, that's enough for this episode. And just stay tuned for what's coming next. And until the next time, this is Uncle Greg. And stay safe. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Uncle Greg Show podcast. Be sure that you like, share, and subscribe this podcast on all social media platforms. And if you have any comments, feel free to email. The links and details for all social media platforms and email address for the Uncle Greg Show podcast are contained in the details section of each podcast. Thank you for listening and be safe.